Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm coming to you with another installment in my Renaissance series. And so today I thought we could discuss art pieces that I think defined the early Renaissance. I was initially just going to do a video all about art in general that I think defined the Renaissance as a whole. But as I started looking into that and thought about doing it, I quickly realized if I committed to that idea, we would have a video that was 3 hours long. And so I decided to kind of separate things out and to limit myself. So I only have 5 art pieces to talk about today. So when talking about the Renaissance, we often generally kind of say that it really took off around the year 1400. And that's certainly when the early Renaissance took off. There's a lot of overlap between early Renaissance art and late medieval art. And so there's often a real conversation between art pieces of this period where you might not be quite sure whether or not you would really say they were Renaissance, because in many ways they resemble people like Giotto, far more than they do people like Botticelli. And I think this is a time period that it can be hard to appreciate the art of because it does skew a little bit medieval. And I really like medieval art, which is an interesting thing to say. Typically, if you like the Renaissance, you're a little bit against medieval art. You find medieval art very flat, very dark. And that's typically how we know we have moved into the Renaissance from the medieval period, is that people start to look a little bit more lifelike in paintings. Paintings seem a little bit more vibrant, and they can be done in different formats than they were previously, which typically make them a little bit more vibrant anyway. So for all intents and purposes, let's say the Renaissance starts the year 1400. And I typically say 1400, 1401 is the beginning of the Italian Renaissance anyway, because this is the date that there was a competition to create new doors for the Florence baptistry. This was a competition that pitted a lot of famous artists who were living in Florence at the time against each other, and it eventually came down to 2 of the most famous goldsmiths in Florence, Lorenzo Ghiberti and Filippo Brunelleschi. And so there was a competition majorly between the 2 of them that continued throughout the rest of their lives, as a matter of fact, but the commission eventually went to Ghiberti. So the competition was to create a panel that would be inserted into these doors, which were originally going to be scenes from the Old Testament. So the subject matter that they had to create for this competition was Abraham and Isaac. Abraham about to sacrifice Isaac. Theirs are the only 2 panels from the competition that survive. You can see them today in the Bargello Museum in Florence. They are really, really stunning. And I think this is a form of art that is really unusual. I love everything about this. And I really love everything about the gates of paradise, which is what Michelangelo went on to term the doors to the Florence baptistry. So the commission was won by Lorenzo Ghiberti, and I will insert his panel here and then Filippo Brunelleschi's. And you can decide for yourself whether or not you think Ghiberti should have won the commission. I do. And to let you know, Ghiberti was 23 at the time that he won this commission and that he started working on the gates of paradise. 23. After winning the commission, the baptistry doors then kind of morphed into being scenes from the New Testament. Then they eventually went back to the Old Testament. Those are the gates that you can see today. They are absolutely beautiful. I mean, genuinely, they are absolutely beautiful. And they still strike people today because when you go to Florence, they do have a replica there on the Florence baptistry. The real doors have been moved into the Museum of the Duomo. You will just see people walk by who maybe are not quite sure what they are, and they're even caught by them. There's something very unusual about the gates of paradise, and they really do look like something that you might envision would welcome you into another realm. They definitely seem very mythical, very overwhelming, very glorious, and they do awe you. Genuinely, this is some of the most stellar work of the Renaissance to me. I actually like quite a bit of the art of the early Renaissance, and in some ways I like it more than some of the high Renaissance works. This is definitely one of those cases for me. I think this is one of the most spectacular feats of sculpture, though I'm not quite sure sculpture is what you would term this. But I have always thought that the competition to create the Florence baptistry doors is the event that kicks off the Renaissance. So these are really interesting pieces of work because not only are they beautiful, but I definitely think you can see that these are some of the pieces that really started the Renaissance. After talking about the great Ghiberti, we ought to talk about the guy who lost to him, and that would be Filippo Brunelleschi. And so Brunelleschi is now remembered mainly for one huge achievement in his life, and he definitely did so much more. He was a fabulous architect, but he is remembered for one thing and one thing only, and I'm sure he would be happy he was remembered for this, but he put the dome on Florence's cathedral, on the Duomo. This took place across multiple years from around 1420 to around 1436. This is a truly spectacular feat of architecture, and you might be wondering why I would include a piece of architecture among artwork, but truly, this is a piece of art. The Florence Duomo is absolutely huge, and it had been there for over a century at this point without a dome. It had always been planned to have a dome, but they didn't have the technology to do it. Basically, there have been no domes since antiquity at this point. And Filippo Brunelleschi, along with Donatello, another of one of the early Renaissance artists, they were some of the first few to really be fascinated by ancient architecture and to think that, hey, we should go down to Rome, we should study these ancient structures, we should study this ancient artwork. And so they really got into kind of archaeology, if you want to say. And Brunelleschi has been to the Pantheon when he comes up with this. And the Pantheon is still probably the most stunning dome in the world. It's really, really incredible. And the technology for how the Romans crafted the dome of the Pantheon had been lost. Brunelleschi tries to replicate that in Florence. He wins the commission for the dome. He was also up against Ghiberti for that, and they eventually kind of started working together on it, were paid the same amount, though Ghiberti was under Brunelleschi, and eventually he was like, this is too much for me, I can't do this, and so he left. The entire commission goes to Brunelleschi, which is great for him. The key with creating the dome, and I'm just going to kind of sum this up into one point because it's actually a very, very difficult thing to summarize. He did a lot of incredible work here, and it's going to sound like I'm saying all he did was come up with this one idea and everything clicked into place, and that's absolutely not true. A lot of work went into the Florence Duomo, but essentially what he does is craft one dome with a smaller dome underneath it for support. And that is what kind of goes on to influence the builders of the Capitol building here in the United States. If you have been to Paris, Invalides is done in the exact same way. And so this is the key for getting the Duomo to stay up. In Florence and in Italy in general, flying buttresses were almost never used because the scaffolding was so dangerous. And so that's why you'll often see these Gothic cathedrals in Italy look very different from Northern Gothic cathedrals of France, England, Germany. They didn't really use flying buttresses, and so that's what he was locked into to craft this dome. It is still to this day the largest brick dome ever done, though it is no longer the largest dome in the world, sadly enough, but it held that title until I think around 1900. It's really an amazing piece of architecture, and to me, it is absolutely a piece of art. Having mentioned Donatello, we should perhaps talk about him next. He is perhaps the most famous of the early Renaissance artists. He is not my favorite Renaissance artist by any stretch of the imagination. I don't much care for his artwork. And you may not either. This is the thing. A lot about the early Renaissance has aged poorly to us because we've seen what the high Renaissance can do. And so it's interesting that perhaps we study things and pieces of Donatello's because of what they did in terms of innovation rather than in terms of their genuine beauty. And so what Donatello did, perhaps most famously, is the first freestanding nude sculpture since antiquity. And he did that in his bronze sculpture of the David. This was done in the 1440s, so a little bit later in Donatello's career. And he has, of course, sculpted David before in marble. David is a very popular subject for sculptors in Florence because David is a big emblem in Florence. He is, of course, the subject of perhaps the most famous sculpture of the Renaissance in Michelangelo's David. Donatello's David is so important in terms of innovation in the Renaissance. It's really, really hard to emphasize how important this sculpture is in the history of art. So when I say the first freestanding nude sculpture since antiquity, I mean no sculpture since the days of ancient Rome has been sculpted nude. All sculptures from the Middle Ages, the kind of beautiful, famous sculptures that are on the outsides of churches, that are inside churches, they're all clothed, they're all robed. So this is the first time that a sculpture has been nude in 1,000 years. Another really important aspect about this sculpture, in my opinion, is that it does kind of indicate what the trend is going to be for the Renaissance, in that it is the perfect blending of mythical and Christian elements. So this is David, a biblical hero, with Goliath, the giant, at his feet. This is a really famous biblical story where David, a young man, defeats the giant Goliath with a slingshot. And so he is sculpted, of course, as David with Goliath at his feet, but he's given long hair and he's wearing a helmet. The helmet is what should be giving you pause. The helmet actually resembles most classical visions of Hermes, the god Hermes. He's often shown wearing a helmet. And there is also something interesting here in terms of how David is positioned. He's a little bit relaxed and he's putting his weight on one foot. This is an ancient position that most ancient sculptures were in, that is called the contrapposto. And so basically that means you're kind of relaxed. Maybe you've got your hand on your hip even, but your weight is on one leg. It's supported by one leg. And so the rest of you can kind of twist away. It's a really artful form that allows you to play with the human body in an interesting way for artists. And it also had not really been done or used since the days of antiquity. Donatello, of course, sculpted many, many other things, but this is perhaps his most famous. This was displayed for years in the Medici Palazzo, in the atrium of the Medici Palazzo. And so right when you kind of walked into their palazzo, there'd be a square with all the rooms around this kind of open air square, and David would have been right there in the middle to kind of awe guests as you were coming in, because you would be entering the house of the most iconic art patrons in Florence's history. So it would wow you immediately as you walked into their house, which I think is really amazing. This has never been one of my favorites, but every time I think about studying it, I am a little bit amazed by it. So even though it doesn't necessarily attract my eye, I think it is easily one of the most important pieces of artwork in history. Another Florentine artist that I think we should discuss is Masaccio. Masaccio is most famous for frescoing the inside of the Brancacci Chapel. This was done in the early 1400s when he was still in his very early 20s. Masaccio died tragically around the age of 26 or 27, and he did not finish the frescoes of this chapel. This chapel is located across the Arno in Florence, and so it's a little bit off the beaten path unless you are obsessed with Renaissance art. I have never been there, and it is on my bucket list. You always need an excuse to return to Florence, in my opinion, and that's my biggest excuse right now for wanting to return. But this is a really, really beautiful chapel that is often called the Sistine Chapel of the early Renaissance, and I can see why. Some of the major innovations here have to do with the fact that he did play around with nude figures in these frescoes, which was very unusual in the medieval period. So you will see paintings of nude people in the Brancacci Chapel frescoes. He also played around a lot with foreshortening, which allows things to appear very far away from you in the fresco and things at the front of the fresco to feel very close to you, which had never really been done before him. This is a really, really important innovation in the Renaissance, and it was used probably most famously in the School of Athens by Raphael, I think is where you can see it most distinctly. But foreshortening is a really important technique in the Renaissance. I think his use of color is also really interesting here, and I think the figures, for the most part, appear to have a personality, which is really, really interesting. People appear very distinct from one another, and that's the unfortunate thing about medieval art, you'll probably find, is that one person looks very much like another, and they all appear rather flat, 2D. And a lot about the Renaissance is that people in paintings appear lifelike. They appear 3D, they appear fully rounded. It seems like in Renaissance paintings, that there is often more that you can't see, that is off the page. You know they have created an entire world, that they've created maybe an entire outfit for someone, and you're only seeing a glimpse of it. You're often seeing just a little bit, but you're curious about what the whole might be. Unfortunately, in medieval art, you often feel like you've seen everything there is to see. I do like medieval art, but there is definitely a big shift from medieval to Renaissance art. I think that is really exemplified in Masacio's frescoes here in the Brancacci Chapel. I did want to mention one piece of Northern Renaissance art that I think is extremely influential. It is perhaps one of the most influential paintings of all time, in my opinion, and that is the Ghent altarpiece, which is sometimes called the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb. This was painted in part by Hubert and Jan van Eyck. And so these were masters of the early Renaissance in Belgium, and this is genuinely some of the most breathtaking art that you can ever see. Truly, look it up. I'm not even doing it justice putting it here on the screen. Look it up, blow it up big on your iPad, your computer, and just zoom in on the detail here. It will amaze you. It will stun and amaze you. And perhaps the most stunning thing about it is that in pictures you would think this is rather small. The Ghent altarpiece is taller than I am, and I am around 5'2", 5'3", for context. So it is a massive piece of work. This piece really does bridge medieval and Renaissance art quite brilliantly, I think. I think you can see definitely elements of medieval art, and I think you can also see how things are starting to change. This was painted, at least in part, I believe, with oil painting, which was also a big innovation in the Renaissance, moving away from tempera into oil painting, which is far more vibrant. Oil is also a little bit more permanent in the sense that it can take more of a beating than tempera can. Tempera is often created by mixing pigment with an egg yolk, and so it flakes a little bit. You'll notice that a lot if you look up medieval art, that it often looks like even things like gold leaf are kind of peeling away, and so oil doesn't really do that. This piece features my favorite Mary in Renaissance art, and that's saying something because Mary is a very popular figure to paint in the Renaissance. I will insert a bigger picture of her here. Stunning! I mean, isn't it just stunning? And she appears so unique and so fully formed as a person. I think Mary has a tendency to look the same across multiple paintings, even in Renaissance art. I think she typically has a very general look, and I like that here she looks really unique and really different. This is, though, unfortunately, one of the most stolen art pieces of all time, and so there are parts of it that have gone missing over the years, specifically the panels of Adam and Eve, which were some of the first nude paintings. They were unfortunately removed from the altarpiece in the 1800s because the nudity kind of offended the sensibilities of the 1800s. They've never been found. In general, it has just been moved around a lot. It was moved around a lot in World War II to avoid it being taken by the Nazis. Panels have been lost. They are, of course, replaced with really wonderful replications of what would have been there, but this is sadly an art piece that has been through quite a bit. It's often thought that a lot of what Jan van Eyck did here, because he really painted the majority of it, that he did it because he was influenced by painters like Masaccio, that he had been to Italy and seen some of the new innovations in art. So this is also a place where you can see conversation is starting to happen about art, and techniques and ideas are starting to flow between different areas. This is a really important facet of the Renaissance, in my opinion. I just think this is really stunning. This is one of my favorite art pieces of all time. I was lucky enough to see it in person when I visited Belgium, when I visited Ghent, and they keep it in this kind of dark black room so light doesn't get on it and damage it any further, and you have to go in with multiple people. The sad thing is everybody gets an audio guide, and you can just hear the audio guide constantly while you were trying to look at the Ghent altarpiece, and it feels like you should be in a space of complete silence to admire it, and that's something that I want to end on with the Ghent altarpiece. There is a quatrain at the bottom of the Ghent altarpiece that discusses Hubert and Jan van Eyck painting this, and the last line of the quatrain is, "Admire what they have done for you," and it gives me chills every single time because it's truly all you can do. All you can do is admire it. This is truly one of the most stunning art pieces of all time, in my opinion. I'm sure I am forgetting many, many instrumental pieces from the early Renaissance, and I would love to know your opinion on these art pieces. I would love to know your favorite art pieces from the early Renaissance and just your favorite Renaissance artworks in general. So hopefully I can return soon with my art pieces that I think defined the high Renaissance. But this was the early Renaissance, which is, I think, a pretty ignored piece of the Renaissance. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.